Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Outbreak.
A tumor. Don't worry, I can't stitch it together, but I can cut the knot.
Never thought I'd be making a 50-minute video game review, but as you can hopefully see already, Pathologic 2 is a very special game, and I wanted to do it justice. It's a sort of survival horror RPG story game where you play a doctor who over the course of 12 days is faced with issues like famine, civil unrest, anarchy, and most importantly, a plague. Those 12 days are misery for everyone involved. Your objective? Find some kind of solution, but most importantly, But Pathologic 2 is so much more than just a game. In my opinion, it would be much more accurate to describe it as an interactive piece of art. Art like you might find in a gallery or a museum. Something that makes you think and feel, not just quote-unquote simple entertainment. It has survival mechanics, crafting, an inventory system, a reputation system, and so on. But these mechanics only serve to make the story more believable, to make the character more immersive, and to underline the emotions, the atmosphere, and ultimately, the story. It takes place in this really obscure town, and when I say obscure, I mean really weird. Everything's really weird. Suddenly, a plague breaks out, and there's only 3 sort of doctors in the town who can help. One of those being played by you, of course. I'll tell you more later in the video. Pathologic 2 is sort of a sequel to Pathologic 1, but it can also be considered a remake of Pathologic 1, or just a standalone product. Pathologic 1 has been generally pretty well received by the community, but the game's visuals and game design simply don't hold up anymore, and honestly, I don't think they even held up back then. It wasn't necessarily bad as a result, just not very digestible. Pathologic 2, on the other hand, is a lot more accessible. The visuals are much nicer, it has a much more modern UI, and honestly, I just think it plays much better. Generally, the Steam reviews seem to agree with me. So just to summarize, you're not missing anything by only playing the second one. They both try to realize the same vision, and the second one is just so much easier to play. Now I'm not gonna lie, I'm low-key obsessed with this game. It has elements of fourth wall breaking. It makes you think about life and death and what it all means. It comments on how societies change with the advance of technology, how urbanization and industrialization create something new but destroy the old. The beautiful thing is, though, that the game leaves it for you to interpret what is good and what is bad. It makes you think so much about society and the way that we approach life and living together. It's almost a study into the nature of humanity. So it takes all of these concepts, combines it with fourth wall breaking, and then fantastic ludonarrative resonance, which I will talk about in more detail later in the video, but essentially it means that in terms of the mood, the atmosphere, the experience that is being communicated to you as the player through the story matches the one that is being communicated to you through the game's mechanics. And this makes the walls break down between you as the player and the character that you are playing. The game makes frequent references to the theater.
Please welcome the actor, Artemi Burach.
It implies that you're merely playing an actor, and this actor is acting out the role of the doctor. Just like me as the player is merely acting as the protagonist is merely acting as the doctor. I find that super fascinating. At some point you even have characters doubting their own realness. They feel like they're going through a predetermined fate, which they are. They're in a video game. The story is already written. And they talk about how only when they talk to you do they feel like something unexpected might happen. It literally gives me chills. One of the elements that is crucial for the ludonarrative resonance is actually the difficulty. After all, you're playing a doctor that is struggling with disease, anarchy, violence, famine. It wouldn't feel very believable if the game was easy, would it? The developers explicitly state that they aren't too fond of stories that are only dark and hurtful on the cover. Pathologic 2 is supposed to be almost unbearable. Otherwise, the effect is lost. And I wholeheartedly agree with this assessment. Pathologic 2 works as well as it does precisely because it's a game and not a movie or a story in a book. It feels like you as the player, not as the protagonist, are part of what is happening. This is why I keep using the phrase interactive piece of art. And precisely because interactivity is at the core of the experience, it is just not something that you can feel just by watching a review. So basically my hope is that after watching this video, you'll be motivated to give Pathologic 2 a shot, or at least walk away from this video with some type of understanding for what the game is and what makes it so special. I'll do my best to explain the mechanics and setting in a way that is easy and quick to understand, so you can come to your own conclusions whether this game is worth your time or not. I've taken a great deal of care to ensure there is as few spoilers as possible, in order for you to have as much mystery as possible left when you play the game yourself. One more thing before we get started. If at this point you're already enjoying the video, it would really mean a lot to me if you could leave me a like, a comment, especially if you have feedback or questions, and consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this. And that's it. Thank you for sticking around. Let's begin. Pathologic 2 doesn't exactly play in our world or our history, but I do think it takes great inspiration from it. The game resembles what I would expect from late 18th century, early 19th century Russia, maybe even something around the time of the Russian Revolution. You'll be spending the roughly 30 hours of game time in this strange town located in the steppe. The town doesn't really have a name beyond Town on Gorkin, which refers to the Gorkin River. The first thing you have to know is that the town is inhabited by quote-unquote regular townspeople, but also an indigenous minority called the Kin. Personally, the Kin made me think of Mongols or Kazakhs, though the game's art book states that they are similar to late 19th century Native Americans, with old chieftains still being alive, but young people going to work at a white man's stone quarries, brothels, and railroad construction sites for a while now. The situation with the Kin is actually really interesting. They are definitely weird, or obscure as the art book calls them. They've got tons of rituals and customs, they have their own language, and so forth. But suddenly they are torn out of their environment, and they are now pushed into a new society, a new language, a new way to organize, new customs and rituals. But most importantly, they are asked to change how they define themselves as individuals. In fact, the concept of individuality is something that's kind of foreign to them. As before, they felt more like one with nature, one with each other, almost like one organism. And they never really cared much to begin with about communicating verbally, about making things precise and concise. So as much as you as the player and also the protagonist don't really understand what's going on, the Kin doesn't understand either. They are just as confused as you are. And so they are left in a state where they simply don't know how to live. They don't understand their place. That's how it felt to me, and that's how the art book describes it as well. Otherwise, the town's pretty normal. There's regular shops. There's a grocery store here, a tailor here. This is a pharmacy. There's some nicer houses. There's children's play areas. There's some parks. There's whatever this is. You've got a church. And then there's this concrete building called the termitary, which I've had to look up. It means a colony of termites.
Oh hey, what's up guys?
You've got publicly available water pumps and water distribution barrels. You got a cemetery, a railway station. You got whatever this floating tower is. There's a nice pub where you can buy some alcohol and just listen to some chill tunes. Sometimes roots grow out of the ground for no reason, and if you pour blood on them, you get some herbs. So, you know, regular everyday kind of stuff. You'll be playing through this normal town as the protagonist, Artemy Burak, who actually grew up in the town, but has been studying medicine outside of the town for a few years now.
Local medicine can do a lot. Although while studying, I started to see it as backwards, but it did work at times.
Artemy's father, Isidore, is a kind of spokesperson / figurehead of the Kin and serves as their doctor. Suddenly, Isidore sends a letter urgently requesting for Artemy to return. And this is where the game begins. Considering the town is about to be hit with a plague, Artemy is in a really unique position to affect the fate of the town. He knows traditional medicine and modern medicine, and is culturally connected to both the Kin, the old ways, and the new ways of man and science. His father is a prominent figurehead, giving Artemy a certain level of believability. But in his years of absence, Artemy has started seeing the ways of the kin as kind of backwards. And to make matters worse, he started forgetting the rituals, customs, and language. So the townspeople and kin are a bit hesitant to accept Artemy back as one of their own. So for both the player and Artemy, there is a whole lot of exploration and rediscovery to be done. One of the most important game mechanics in Pathologic 2 is time, because time never stands still, unless you shut down or pause the game, of course. The game is split into 12 in-game days. Certain activities can only be done on one day, and if you don't manage to do them, the opportunity is lost forever. So if you find out another character, let's say a friend of yours, is going to do some activity or go somewhere, you have to reach them before they do the thing they have planned. Otherwise, best case, you just miss out on some lore and dialogue. Worst case, they go through with a terrible idea that ends very badly for them. And unfortunately, there's not usually enough time to do everything you could be doing on a given day. Time also plays a crucial role because the game has bars for health, hunger, thirst and stamina, and exhaustion. So you also need to use some of your time to loot, go to a shop or otherwise trade items, and sleep. So precisely because time is so limited, you'll have to start trading off your immediate needs like hunger, exhaustion, thirst, health, versus the immediate needs of the town, so trying to help individual people and protect important characters from the plague. Then there's also the long-term goals that you have to invest some energy into, so trying to decipher the mystery of what's going on and trying to find a solution. This makes time the most important resource, kind of like in real life. To help you out with prioritization, the game has a really nice map and journal system. The game displays story as well as past and present tasks and revelations in a graphical manner. Each idea is represented by a bubble. When you hover the mouse over one of the bubbles, some text will appear to remind you of what you have learned or what task you are currently pursuing and why. When an idea is somehow logically linked to another one, a line is made between those two. If a thought that you have already discovered has other thoughts connected to it that you have not yet discovered, the game will just display an outline, giving you a little hint of what is to come. If an idea or task is connected to a location in the town, it will actually be displayed to you in the world map as well, so you don't have to guess where everything is. However, this is not always the case. You're not just running from marker to marker. New thought bubbles are added automatically, either when a certain amount of time passes, or if you simply discover something new in conversation or by being in the right area at the right time. This system gives you all the information you need to make informed decisions, so you can spend what little time that you do have wisely, and plot efficient routes across the map. This is hands down one of the coolest ways I've ever seen video games display and organize information and tasks for the player. If you're familiar with the so-called mind mapping technique, it's basically that, but in video game form. I think it works as well as it does because it mimics the way that humans store and recollect information, because things that you know are always related to something else that you know, and it leans into that concept of relatedness. Normally, I'd like to talk about the mechanics of a game before diving into the feelings that those mechanics evoke, but in the case of Pathologic 2, I think the opposite makes more sense. I think it's pretty evident that the mechanics are simply a result of how the developers wanted the game to feel. So if we discuss the game feel first, this will also be pretty good context for the more detailed discussion on mechanics. A lot of time in Pathologic 2 is simply spent walking from point of interest to point of interest, and that's actually a very good thing. First of all, because time is such a limited resource, every time you have to walk a long distance, it becomes an exercise in efficient route planning. Not because it's difficult to find a way to your destination, but because there's a lot of things you can and should be doing on the way. It's a skill you can practice, and I will explain what I mean by this in the next chapter. The second benefit provided by the walking is the mental downtime. It is not at all clear at any point in time what is happening in Pathologic 2. There is multiple sources of information, you never get the full picture from anybody, people's statements usually contradict each other, and to make matters worse, everybody talks in a kind of cryptic way that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. For the entire time that you're playing this game, it feels like there's an unresolved puzzle. You try to tug at all the threads, but it just doesn't come loose. Well, it does a little bit, but only a little bit. So generally, there is always unresolved questions in your head, you don't know what's going to happen next, and you just can't stop thinking about it. So the time between points of interest is useful simply to have some time to think about things, to process what you've seen and learned, what you were told, interpret it, come up with your own version of what you think is happening, trying to predict the future, coming up with a plan to meet your own needs and the needs of the town, and so forth. The developers have created a very specific kind of atmosphere. The amount of ambiguity, the room for interpretation, planning, and anticipation is big enough to be mentally engaging, but not so big that you would get frustrated or feel like there is no point. One other thing that plays extremely well into this feeling the developers are trying to create is the plethora of references to theater. The entire game is constructed around the concept of a theatric performance. The game starts in the theater, the hospital is built in the theater, the NPCs who give you tutorial information are stagehands wearing black costumes with a white mask. The so-called orderlies, which are basically non-medical nurses, are wearing old theatrical costumes. And one of the most important characters that you keep talking to is the director of the theater, who does a lot of foreshadowing.
The play is afoot.
He also often addresses you as if you're more of an actor or merely a role, which then really heavily leans into the concept of fourth wall breaking, but ironically, at the same time, also ludonarrative resonance. I'll discuss this in a later chapter. And then to kind of round all these things together, between the days, there is always a theatrical performance being played out in the theater.
I feel an innate resentment towards you.
This theatric performance serves as a way to kind of process what happened in the previous day and to help you make sense of the events that are unfolding. Sometimes the performances will alert you to a crisis that is coming up, which then helps you prepare. And I would say that most of these revelations come to you while you are running through the town. Again, the downtime is crucial to processing what's going on. And I'm really sorry, but this is something that you just have to experience yourself. Talking more about this will simply spoil the story. I'm considering making a Pathologic 2 analysis video where I can go into more detail on these things without having to worry about spoilers. If this is something you'd be interested in, please leave a comment. But remember that you actually play a doctor in a town that is undergoing a plague and a famine? Yeah, there's a bunch of other negative feelings that come as a result of that. Despair, frustration, fear, maybe even anger. These feelings come mostly as a result of the art design, the sound design, as well as the mechanics and particularly the difficulty. I'll be discussing these things gradually as we go forward, but I will dedicate an entire section to difficulty. So, to summarize, when the protagonist is running through the town doing seemingly nothing but running, I imagine that he's doing the same thing that I as the player am doing. Thinking about the fact that I have to find some food and water, about how I want to check up on 3 other patients because I'm concerned they're not going to make it, about how I'm trying to cure this plague, thinking that I have to make it to this character in time and try to persuade them from making a bad choice, thinking about how I might have to break into somebody's home and go through their stuff, maybe even kill them if they're there, just so I can sell the spoils and afford a piece of bread or immunity boosters to protect myself. These types of thoughts and feelings are strongest when the game creates space for them, which is exactly what it does by having you walk so much. In my opinion, without this, the game would not work. The second benefit of all the walking in Pathologic 2 is purely mechanical. So in this chapter, I'll tell you a bit about the core game mechanics and how they tie in with the downtime and walking. In Pathologic 2, there's usually more places that you'd like to go to than you have time to go to. So good route planning is absolutely vital to your success. There's 3 key aspects to consider for this. First of all, there's the obvious points of interest. You'll want to cover as many as possible. Secondly, you'll be trying to avoid obstacles and dangers, for example, an infected district. Thirdly, you will try to optimize the resources that you can obtain and the survival needs that you can cover while you are walking. You'll be doing this by finding places where you can trade, barter, loot, maybe even pillage, do combat, craft various items, but also something simple like trying to find a bed to sleep in. It is very difficult to reliably meet your own needs and to have resources left over to be a doctor to the town, which is actually also kind of important for personal survival. Plus, there are random things that happen from time to time, and the town also changes visually as the events unfold, so you do discover new stuff as well, which keeps things interesting. Now you might have noticed that I said both trading and bartering, and this was no mistake. These are actually 2 separate mechanics. The trading has you go to specific shops, like a tailor or a grocery store, and spend money there or sell your items to it. Bartering, on the other hand, is all about exchanging items for items with regular townspeople. You can barter with almost everyone you see. There's different kinds of NPCs which have different types of items for offer, and are also only interested in certain types of items from you. The amount of NPCs and type of NPCs varies from location to location. And to make a concrete example, if you're looking for children, you should probably try the playground. So naturally, you'll be taking into account location of bartering partners in your pathfinding. As you'll play, you'll gradually learn who has what, who wants what, and how valuable certain items are to certain people. It might feel a bit overwhelming in the beginning, but trust me, this is something that just kind of clicks after a few hours. Also, talking to a new NPC is kind of like opening an NPC loot box, because you never know what they'll have for sale. As for how to actually obtain items, let me put it this way. You'll become quite the proficient trash panda. You know what they say, one man's trash is another man's garbage. Or something like that. In addition to that, you can also do some pillaging. Though be careful, when people ask you for a house call, they do not mean for you to come in, kill them because they're sick, go through their cabinet for food, do an autopsy on them for their organs for research purposes, and then bolt. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is a valid strategy, but be prepared for the negative reputation impact. Trust me, you do not want people to be upset with you. Each district has a separate reputation for you. If the reputation gets too bad, people won't barter with you anymore. If it gets even worse, they will attack you on sight. But to be fair, if you do end up harvesting organs and blood, you can always craft it into painkillers and just treat townspeople with it. That's right, Pathologic 2 features fantastic doctor mechanics involving gross ethics violations. The doctor gameplay is a sort of minigame. You first have to diagnose what's wrong with the person and then administer the correct treatment, which is antibiotics. Antibiotics you cannot craft, but you do craft the items that you use to diagnose people. These tinctures also serve a purpose as immunity boosters. You can either take them yourself to protect yourself from infection when you enter an infected district, or you can administer it to people who you want to protect from the plague. So one more thing you have to do when you plan your routes is to try and find more resources for doctoring, be it finding herbs or going to your workshop to do some crafting, be it trying to obtain antibiotics from stores or through bartering. And of course also trying to follow up on the story, trying to find a cure, trying to maneuver all the intricacies of the politics and so forth. And of course also to reach all the various patients that you're supposed to be helping. It really is quite challenging to be a good doctor in this town. Now let me talk a bit about the art direction. As I've mentioned in the settings chapter, the game appears to take place in late 18th century, early 19th century Russia, which of course is reflected in the architecture, technology level, and people that you see. According to the art director Mythos, the clothing was specifically designed to create in the player a sense of crisis, as if there's a war going on in people's heads. They've incorporated lots of elements of asymmetry, specifically to unsettle you. And I do have to say I find the clothing to be really good. It really fits the overall mood. However, Pathologic 2 has actually gotten a lot of criticism for the way the townspeople were designed. People say they look too similar. This criticism is totally valid. NPCs coming from the same archetype look basically identical. Now I leave it up to you to decide whether this is good or bad, but I do want to highlight that this is intentional. I'm going to quote the art book again. "We have to portray the townsfolk as a Greek chorus, depersonalized in the utmost, a many-headed hive mind. Not a collection of individuals, but a mass, devoid of color and personality, soulless. Like others, they will use the pronoun I and sometimes tell personal stories, but it has to look like subterfuge, an exception to the rule, leaving the player with an impression of facing something non-human and dangerous. Toys pretending to be people."
That's right. I am dangerous.
Now I've had to look this up, but a Greek chorus is, surprise surprise, a theatrical term. In Greek drama, the term chorus refers to a group of actors who act as a group as opposed to acting as individuals. The Greek chorus sort of provides context information to the viewer of the play. Sometimes they sing or dance, sometimes they might wear masks, but the idea is that they act together to create one role, not 50 individual roles. So in Pathologic 2, the idea is that the townspeople are a chorus. Their role is to be townspeople. Or I suppose if you go in a bit more detail, to be children, to be soldiers, to be bandits, and so on. I mean, maybe it's just a way for them to reduce the amount of assets they've had to make, but at the same time, it really does make them very depersonalized, and for a game where I'm supposed to feel kind of alone, that's a pretty smart design choice. So yeah, the people are not going to be a source of solace for you, and they're certainly not going to be the only thing that feels a little bit wrong or uncomfortable about the art design. Other than that, the buildings look kind of run down. There's a lot of depressing colors, lots of brown and dark. There's barely any green. If there's any vegetation, it's usually kind of dry looking. Everything's there to support the same motif. The art book mentions that they're leaning into the concept of things being worn out. It's largely a game about what things used to be and will become, rather than what they are. And I do think that for the most part when I was playing it, I was always looking at the surroundings thinking, I wonder what this looked like in its prime. Or, I wonder what will happen with this place. Which of course also happens because the town is literally going through a plague and a famine, so of course you wonder what will happen to it. But still, it did what they wanted it to do. Beyond the architecture of individual buildings, the architecture of the entire town is built in a way where you never really have a big line of sight. Each district has its own flair, so some of them do feel a bit more organic than others, but usually you do have some kind of fog that limits your view distance. The streets are not usually very straight or very long. It makes you feel kind of trapped, like you don't know what to expect around the corner. This entire mood is also complemented with fantastic light and shadow effects, and absolutely beautiful 2D sprites for the items that you can find. The purpose of the design choices is to make you feel unsettled and to make you feel like there is always more, like things are not what they appear to be at first glance, like something is going on but you can't quite figure out what it is. The world invites you to try and make sense of it, but it defies understanding. One of the most obvious examples is the various rocks that you can find in the game world. I mean, look at them, they're rocks, but they look so organic. It's just really creepy. The developers refer to this as interactivity of interpretation. For example, when houses get infected, they change appearance and they get these weird scales, and you wonder, what the hell are they? When a district is infected, you get these strange clouds of darkness. And considering the clouds chase you, they appear to be at least sort of conscious? I mean, what the hell is this? Are they some kind of insects? Is this some kind of magical thing? And again, what the hell is up with this impossible geometry? There's really fucking strange things in this game, okay? But it all fits together. I don't know how, but it does. I'm concerned that you're thinking they just made the world weird just to be able to say, hey, we're edgy and different. But that's really not an accurate way to describe this game. Words are kind of failing me here. Again, it's better if you just experience it yourself. But there's one thing I can say. When the game was over, I did not feel cheated. I did not feel like it was weird just for weirdness' sake. I felt like the world that they have constructed, yes, it is weird, but it has the world building to back it up. It feels like this world could exist. It doesn't feel arbitrary at all. Ambiguous? Yes, very much so, but not arbitrary. Now, ambiguity as a storytelling medium is not new. Let me quote the former narrative director. It would be silly to deny that everyone copied the lore in the item description thing from Dark Souls, and yes, so did I. Ambiguity, interactivity of interpretation, whatever you want to call it, this is not a new way to do storytelling, but Pathologic 2 incorporates it so well in its visual design, its sound design, its narrative design, its dialogue and so forth. It's remarkable. If you do end up playing the game, I highly recommend to buy the art book afterwards and to read through it. You know, I almost wish that I could have read the art book before playing it the first time, just so I could have appreciated more in my first playthrough. But to be fair, I think that would spoil the experience quite a lot, so I don't think you should do that. The sound design in Pathologic 2 is honestly pretty fantastic, with some limitations. I would split it up into 4 components: the music, the ambient sounds, dialogue and NPC voice lines, and lastly things like action sounds, so UI elements, walking, fighting, and so forth. From these 4, the music is by far the best. About 1/3 of the musical tracks are made by a band called Theodore Bastard. The other 2/3 are made by a guy called Vasily Kashnikov, who was also involved in the soundtrack of Pathologic 1, as well as a game called The Void, which is made by the same studio as Pathologic 1 and Pathologic 2. The styles of the two definitely have some differences, but again, they all support the same kind of motif and game feel. In terms of style, it resembles something like folk music or ambient music. It's really hard to narrow it down to just one genre. It really is just its own thing. What you heard in the introduction video is a song called Umbraya Erze from Theodore Bastard. And no, I have no idea what that means. I couldn't find anything online. So you've got songs like that are slightly more on the energetic side, but of course the songs are quite different from each other. Some of them use drums or some kind of string instrument, like for example the song Odong. Others rely heavily on some kind of chanting and voices, like the song Disappearing. And for some of them, like River of Phlegm, I don't know. I can't even identify the instruments used for it. Depending on how far the story has progressed and where you are in the world, what you've just done, different tracks will be playing to match the mood as best as possible. Maybe actually not matching, maybe it's more like shaping the mood, but the two are hard to distinguish, which is a very good thing. A good example is one called Miracle Workshop, because this is the one that plays whenever you go back to your workshop. The track kind of sends you a signal that you can kind of calm down a bit, relax a bit, like you can let your guard down. It's not a happy track, but it does feel homely and calm. The music is then complemented with outstanding ambient sounds, with some caveats, because for some of the sounds, there's just too much repetition. Despite that, they work really well to facilitate the atmosphere, and it took me quite a long time to understand what makes them so powerful. Ambient sounds have directionality in two axes. Based on how it sounds on your left ear versus your right ear, you can tell from which direction the sound is coming from. Then, based on the pitch and the volume, you can sort of tell how far it is and whether it's in a building or not. This makes the game feel so much more immersive. The funny thing is though, these are ambient sounds. They're not tied to any in-game events, they're literally just there for the mood. So it was really surprising to feel like they are localized somewhere inside the game world, because this makes them substantially more real than just ambience. The entire point of ambience is that it's background, it's not real. But the ambient sounds that Pathologic 2 uses, it really feels like if I go around the corner, I'm gonna find whatever made that sound. That's a pretty cool effect. Especially because at some point you start feeling a little bit paranoid, because you kind of know that there's nothing there, but you heard something, and it feels real. This is one more of those things that I wish you could just experience for yourself. Honestly, I don't think I've ever paid this much attention to ambient sounds before, so for all I know, every other game has exactly the same effect. Maybe that's why I got a bit annoyed at the repetition, I don't know. But there is something to be said about how well it ties into the game experience. I will now show you a short clip to highlight how the ambience, music, and of course visual design tie in together to create a very strong atmosphere. As for the dialogue and the NPC voice lines, let me first talk about the dialogue. When you initiate conversation with an important NPC, they will speak a one-liner to you, but the conversation itself will actually take place purely in text.
We need to get back to the front.
And Vlad stays quiet. Has his finger in the pie, I'm sure.
Worst of all, a coward. Always was a coward. How I hate it.
At first, it was a bit strange and I had to get used to it, but I do think these one-liners are fantastic. They're cryptic, they're creepy, they're weird. As with the visual design, everything plays towards the same kind of unsettling mood. When I played Pathologic 2 for the first time, I didn't really notice that many negative things about the voice lines and the dialogue, but after watching Mandalore's review for Pathologic 2, I do want to echo his criticism because I think it's totally valid. When a bandit aggroes you, he usually yells the same voice line at you, and it's not even a good one.
Hey, you.
So in addition to having to fight somebody with not so fun combat mechanics, you also get this really annoying repetitive voice line. And to make matters worse, if there's more than one bandit, they might both yell the same voice line at you. They really could have done a better job here. As for the kind of action and UI sounds, I don't really have any comments. Those were totally fine. When Pathologic 2 first released, it was definitely way too hard. The developers had to make a patch to make it a bit easier, and now you can even customize the difficulty, which is really nice. I've never played the original version, so I don't know what that was like. But what I can say is that the difficulty is a crucial component to the game's experience. I'm going to repeat the point I've made in the introduction section. You're playing a doctor in a town that's facing famine, the plague, anarchy. If the game was easy, it would not feel believable. The difficulty is partially what makes the game feel so great. It's what ensures Ludonarrative Resonance, which, by the way, I will finally discuss in the next section. Alright, we've established the game is hard, we've established it's a good idea for it to be hard, so now let me explain why it is hard. The best way to summarize why Pathologic 2 is hard is with the words resource shortage. And this affects every aspect of the game. I've already discussed that time is one of the most crucial resources that is also fairly limited, but of course this has secondary implications as well. If you only have so much time, then for example, how do you find time to rest in a bed to get your exhaustion down? Well, you could be eating coffee beans, but that means yet another resource that you first have to obtain and then consume for a one-time benefit. You also have to eat and drink quite frequently. Theoretically, you can always be buying stuff at a store, but it's not like you're playing an MMO with quests that give you money as a reward. Money is hard to come by. Combat can also be quite dangerous, especially considering the fact that weapons are not easy to obtain, and they degrade quite quickly. Plus, most of the weapons are dual use. For example, lockpicks. You can use them for fighting, but then you might not have any lockpicks left for lockpicking. The same goes for scalpels as well. If you fight with them too much, then you won't have them for autopsies. There's also rifles, revolvers, and shotguns, which themselves are very hard to obtain. And as for the ammunition, that's of course not an easy item to find either. And to make matters worse, it's actually a very good bartering item. So again, you have to make a trade-off. Do I invest in my defense, or do I buy something like food or medicine? Moving on from the combat, there's also clothing that protects you from the infection, but it degrades quite quickly, meaning you have to use more tinctures and immunity boosters, or instead go around infected districts, which could cost a lot of time. I've also mentioned this in the introduction, but Pathologic 2 puts you into a position where you have to be selfish. You have to take care of yourself first. When all you can afford is either a piece of bread or an antibiotic to treat a patient, you're probably gonna go for the bread. Trade-off is the perfect term to describe the kind of item economy in the game. Everything is a balance, and you have to find the right one for your playthrough and situation. I have to say that for me, trying to find this balance was actually quite fun. The resource scarcity, again, the difficulty, that's exactly what creates the feelings of desperation, the desire for everything to just be over. It's so fantastic to make the game feel more immersive. It really helps to drive you as well when you're playing, because there's always something that you need to address immediately, which eliminates the kind of open world fatigue, where there's just too much stuff to do and you don't really know what to do next. Looking at you, Ubisoft. With all that being said though, the game is hard, but it's not unbeatable. Personally, I've played it on the standard difficulty, and with the exception of 1 or 2 days, I was mostly doing okay on food. But to be fair, I did play the game about a third of the way before my first total playthrough, so I already knew what to look out for. Oh, and one more thing, if we ignore this sort of game mechanics-induced difficulty, then there's still one more element to consider. Life and the world is just not fair. If characters don't like you, if they're looking for a scapegoat, especially considering that some of them have ulterior motives, or are just plain scared and are trying to make the best of a bad situation, they might throw you under the bus. And it's not your fault, but it could happen anyway. I'm going to share with you my all-time favorite quote from Star Trek, Perfect Life Advice.
It is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness. That is life.
I believe I understand, sir.
There's one thing that makes the game a bit easier though. When you die, you don't die.
Wait, that doesn't make any sense.
When you die, you get transported into the theater, and the theater director, Mark Immortel, will tell you that you get to try again, but there are some consequences.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players.
From now on, every single save game from that run is tainted. That's right, the amount of deaths and the consequences for dying are saved across save games. So there's no save scumming this one. You'll just have to live with the consequences of your own actions. Just like in real life. I know that all of this doesn't necessarily sound like fun. Don't get me wrong, I had fun with the game, but fun is not the most important thing that I've gotten out of the experience. When Pathologic 1 released, it actually started a big debate on whether video games have to be fun to be good. This is a bit of a philosophical question. Personally, I don't think video games have to be fun to be good, but there is other opinions out there, and this video is not about philosophy. So let's move on. Now, I'm not quite sure who coined the term originally, but Ludonarrative Resonance refers to a kind of harmony. A harmony between a game's mechanics and its story. It might be a bit easier to understand the concept if I give you a counterexample for ludonarrative dissonance. You've most likely experienced so many instances of ludonarrative dissonance. In fact, I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that most games that come out are ludonarratively dissonant. Does this sound familiar? Imagine you're an all-powerful hero. You can kill hundreds of enemies. You're basically unstoppable. Any injury either doesn't hurt you or you heal from it super quickly. But then suddenly there's a cutscene, and in the cutscene a lowly weak enemy shoots you. You've been shot hundreds of times before and it never bothered you. But the moment you get shot in the cutscene, suddenly your character can take it? It makes no sense. And then you find yourself being captured and trapped, and you think to yourself, if they would have let me play out that cutscene, I would have been fine. And I'm sure you can relate to the feeling of frustration when that happens. It just feels kind of stupid. Another good example for ludonarrative dissonance are games where, again, you are some sort of hero who has to save the world or save your friend or whatever, and you're on a time-sensitive quest. Every hour, thousands die, or you only have one day to save your friend. But then the game releases you, and the first thing you do is you go fishing. You go looking for crafting materials. You help out this old lady in this one village who's looking for a shoe she lost. Most likely, you've experienced plenty of games like this. But truly, very few games attempt to, or even manage to actually pull off, ludonarrative resonance, the alignment of mechanics and story. Pathologic 2 is one of these cases. I've tried to hint at this over the course of the last few sections already. Everything in the game is designed to provide a very specific kind of experience. And this includes everything, not just the mechanics. We're talking about visuals, we're talking about sound, dialogue, stories, UI. We're even talking about architecture of the city, how the roads are shaped, just everything. Everything is aligned. This harmony, that's what ludonarrative resonance is. It makes the game feel significantly more immersive, significantly more believable. It reduces the gap between you as the player, so the one who bought the game and is playing it on your machine or console, and the protagonist. When you're walking through town and going about your duties as a doctor, you're thinking about things that you've seen or heard, trying to make sense of them, trying to learn from them, come up with some sort of action plan. You're thinking about how to best save the town, how to help as many people as possible. You're thinking about the patients you have to check up on, trying to judge if going through the infected district is worth the risk, or if you even have enough time to go around, where you can find your next meal, where to get more medication. You're trying to understand who of the people in the town you can trust, if your old friends are still your friends or not, if maybe what you're doing is actually a fool's errand, like some characters are suggesting, and if maybe you should have listened to somebody else and tried a different approach. For all of these thoughts, can you tell if I'm referring to the player or the protagonist? I'm referring to both, and the fact that it applies to both, that's exactly the point I want to make. I read this really interesting article on medium.com, and I love the title of it, Pathologic 2, When Gameplay is the Story. So if you take all of that and you couple it with the fact that Pathologic 2 has such heavy references to theater and some fourth wall breaking, and you've got yourself a very, very powerful mix. It's honestly very difficult to summarize how the ludonarrative resonance, the fourth wall breaking, and the references to theater tie in together without going into the spoiler territory, but there's one thing that I do want to say. The game acknowledges that everybody's just an actor, everybody. And most of the time when characters talk to you, they are talking to Artemy. But sometimes it's clear that they are not. But because the game addresses the fact that there is somebody behind Artemy, you end up feeling so much more personally involved. And because the gap between the protagonist and you is so small already, you feeling more involved means you feel more in line with the protagonist. I mean, come on, the game even starts in the theater, in the backstage, where you put on your costumes. It's a truly remarkable effect, and one of the most unique effects I've ever experienced in video games. I know that so far I've been speaking very positively about Pathologic 2, but there are plenty of things that bothered me and that I really think should have been improved before release. I'm not going to start listing tiny bugs and weird design choices now, I'm just going to summarize it. The game has a very large amount of jank. Don't get me wrong, everything kind of pertaining to looting and UI and crafting, that works pretty flawlessly, and I haven't really run into any issues with dialogue and so forth either. So when I say the game is janky, I don't mean that it's full of bugs. I think the feeling of jank comes primarily from two things. First of all, not so good NPC pathfinding, and secondly, animations. When it comes to pathfinding, you'll see it in this clip pretty well. Sometimes NPCs just follow really strange paths. I think that this group of people is supposed to kind of be chasing this guy in the front, but it looks like they're just playing tag or something. You'll notice this in many aspects. NPCs doing weird rounds, approaching another NPC from a weird angle, stuff like that. When it comes to animations, one thing that I think is really disappointing, though you can't really blame the developers for this, is the fact that there isn't really that many facial animations with the NPC that you're talking to.
Only a fool would cut the Gordian knot. It ought to be vivisected.
So when they talk, they look kind of lifeless. And that's a bit of a mischance, because there are facial animations, they're just not super prevalent. Sometimes you'll also see NPCs fighting, and it just looks pretty ridiculous. Combat sometimes feels okay, it feels like a really rough fist fight, but also sometimes it just feels really stupid. The game comes so close to being wonderfully, perfectly immersive. So these aspects really bum me out. But beyond this, the biggest issue for me is honestly the technical performance. The game runs just fine in general, but when the game seems to load new assets and textures, there's frequent stutters. Not just when you load into the game or get into a new building, sometimes when you just change districts. And it doesn't just happen once in a blue moon, it basically happens every play session several times. Especially in the beginning of the play session. I guess once the game has been going for a while, there's a lot of stuff that's already cached, so it becomes less of an issue. So yeah, it's pretty annoying. In addition to the stutters, there's also surprisingly long loading times. Not just when you load a save game, but also whenever you open a door, the game always loads the area that you're entering into. So sometimes when you open a door, the game just freezes for like 10, 20, 30 seconds. It doesn't sound like much, but I really feel like it breaks the flow of the game. It kind of breaks immersion a little. What makes me especially frustrated with this is that the game is on an SSD for me, and I have a pretty good CPU and GPU, so hardware is not the issue. In my opinion, this is just not an acceptable level of quality for a video game. And one more thing for the doors. Once you do load in and the animation for opening a door has finished, the camera view kind of jumps. I really don't understand. This is such an uncomfortable effect. Why is this in the game? But alright, when all is said and done, I'm still really happy that I found this game and that I ended up playing it. Despite the technical problems and the jank, there's something truly unique about this game, something that no other game provides, so I think it still deserves a big recommendation. But here's the thing, things that might not be a deal breaker for me might very well be a deal breaker for you. So hopefully this section helped you inform your decision a bit more. Or it was just interesting in general, I guess. That's fine too. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm really struggling to come up with a good conclusion for this video. For one, I've never made anything of this complexity and length. But that's not really the reason. Pathologic 2 is just such an odd game. I didn't even like Pathologic 2 at first. I tried to play it, didn't like it, then took a break for a year, but eventually curiosity got the better of me and I started a new playthrough. I didn't necessarily like it that much more when I started the second time, but I was committed to push through, and I'm really happy that I did. The more hours I started putting into it, the more I started realizing that there really is something truly unique here, something remarkable. The game wasn't necessarily being super fun, but I still found it to be so enriching. I was so intrigued by what was going on. I started to marvel at all the weird design choices and the strange visuals. I realized that I am actually really curious about what's going on in the town. I wanted to learn more about the backstory, how the town got created, who these people are, what their goals are. I started realizing just how much I appreciate the sound design and the music, and especially the light effects, shadow effects, and the atmosphere, by which I mean things like cloud and fog. But again, it took me a failed attempt and a long break to actually finish the game. It really took a while for me to understand just what I'm looking at, what I'm playing, and where the value lies. I think to a certain degree, I simply didn't have the right expectations when I started playing it the first time. But expectations are actually incredibly important when it comes to experiencing really anything. If you have the wrong ones, you set yourself up for disappointment. Or you don't really try to see it for what it is because you're so caught up with what you think it should be. If you go into Counter-Strike expecting Call of Duty, you're bound to have a bad time. My biggest takeaway really was that Pathologic 2 is something that you have to kind of open up to, and you have to make yourself emotionally available, to not just interpret the weirdness as being weird for weirdness' sake, but instead let it spark your curiosity. You might have to push yourself at least a little bit, and not focus too much on the jank, and just let the game tell its story. There's a quote that's attributed to Sid Meier and Soren Johnson, the people behind the Civilization series. Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. Sometimes optimization can be exactly what is fun about a game, but this is not one of those times. Don't think about it as a video game that you have to win, one where you're just accumulating resources and bars are filling up. Don't think about it so much in terms of just an optimization problem. Simply let the game play out and see what happens. It may or may not end up being fun for you, but as I said earlier, I don't think it has to be fun to be worth your time. I hope that together with all the previous chapters and my little speech that I just gave, it's clear what the game is and isn't, what kind of value it provides, and just what kind of journey you'd be embarking upon if you give it a chance. Pathologic 2 is not exactly a super successful game, but especially considering the fact that it's a single-player game, it has a surprisingly strong fan base. And not just people who say, oh, the game's pretty good, but people who are actively preaching the church of Pathologic 2, just like I am doing. I hope that simply this fact alone is enough to convince you that there is more here than meets the eye. This was certainly an aspect that made me want to dig deeper. And the more I started reading, especially after I read the art book, I just fell in love with the game. I've been doing lots of talking, this video has been super long, but really, My genuine, sincere hope is that you're at least a little bit intrigued at this point. I do think you should give the game a shot, again, because I think this is an interactive piece of art, and the point is that you are the one who's interacting. But I totally understand if you're not really feeling too motivated to play it. But if you do want to learn more about the game anyway, there's tons of great articles and YouTube videos out there that talk about it in more detail. A great starting point is H. Bomber Guy's analysis of Pathologic 1. The video is over 2 hours long, and I think it's worth every minute of it. It's a fantastic video. Otherwise, again, the art book is really, really good. You've got tons of great articles online on the game's difficulty and what it means for video games as a whole. If you're looking for any kind of recommendations on how to learn more about this game, feel free to drop me a comment on YouTube, or you can also head on over to my community Discord and I'd be happy to drop you a list over there. Regardless of how you feel about the game, I really hope that you've enjoyed my video, and I'm really thankful that you've stuck around to the end. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I know everybody says this, but it would really help me out if you could leave me a like and maybe even a comment if you have some feedback or questions, and consider subscribing if you like my style of content. Also, there should be a link on the screen for another video of mine, so click that if you're interested. Thanks a lot and have a wonderful rest of your day.